Most students today mistake information gathering for true knowledge. They accumulate facts like coins in a jar, never realizing they possess the tools for transformation but lack the method to forge wisdom. After decades of observing brilliant minds exhaust themselves in fruitless pursuits, I have witnessed a profound truth. Contemplation is not the enemy of rigorous thinking, it is its highest expression. The ancients understood what we have forgotten. There exists a hierarchy of knowledge, and the most elevated forms remain locked until we learn the art of contemplative engagement. Today, I shall reveal how this forgotten science opens doors that mere analysis cannot even perceive, transforming the very nature of how we encounter truth. The modern intellectual lives in perpetual motion, gathering information at breathtaking speed yet remaining strangely impoverished in wisdom. This paradox reveals our fundamental misunderstanding of knowledge itself. True learning requires not just the accumulation of data, but the cultivation of a contemplative disposition that allows deeper truths to emerge. Through my years of teaching and study, I have discovered that contemplation serves as the key that unlocks forms of knowledge completely inaccessible to the hurried mind. When we learn to still our intellectual restlessness and approach truth with patient reverence, we discover that reality reveals levels of meaning previously hidden from our view. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Knowledge: Why Some Truths Resist Direct Assault. Modern education treats all knowledge as equally accessible through the same methods: direct analysis, logical deduction, and systematic investigation. Yet any serious student eventually encounters truths that seem to retreat the more aggressively we pursue them. These are not lesser truths, but higher ones that demand a different approach entirely. Consider the nature of beauty. You may analyze a sunset's wavelengths, measure its luminosity, and catalog its atmospheric conditions, yet the essence of its beauty remains untouched by such methods. The moment we attempt to capture beauty through pure analysis, it dissolves like morning mist. This is not because beauty is illusory, but because it belongs to a higher order of reality that requires contemplative receptivity rather than analytical aggression. The same principle applies to wisdom, love, justice, and the deepest philosophical insights. These realities possess what I call contemplative resistance. They reveal themselves only to minds that approach with patient reverence rather than impatient demand. The contemplative mind does not abandon rigorous thinking but recognizes that some truths require a different quality of attention. This hierarchy of knowledge has been recognized throughout history. Aristotle distinguished between practical knowledge and contemplative wisdom. Augustine spoke of the eyes of the heart that perceive spiritual realities. Aquinas developed sophisticated distinctions between various modes of knowing, recognizing that the highest truths require both reason and contemplative illumination. When we approach knowledge contemplatively, we discover that truth has its own rhythm and timing. The mind that tries to force insights finds itself grasping at shadows, while the patient contemplative discovers that understanding often arrives as gift rather than conquest. This does not diminish the role of rigorous thinking but elevates it by providing the proper context for its exercise. The contemplative approach recognizes that our intellect possesses multiple capacities, not all of which operate through discursive reasoning. Just as the eye perceives color through direct receptivity rather than logical deduction, the contemplative intellect can apprehend certain truths through what the medievals called simple intuition, a direct seeing that transcends the step-by-step process of rational analysis. This does not contradict reason but complements it, providing a foundation upon which discursive thinking can build more securely. Think of how a master craftsman knows his materials. Yes, he understands their chemical properties and mechanical characteristics, but he also possesses a deeper knowledge born of years of contemplative engagement with wood, stone, or metal. This knowledge emerges not from textbooks but from patient attention to the reality itself. Similarly, the contemplative scholar develops an intuitive familiarity with truth that guides and enriches all subsequent analysis. The tragedy of modern intellectual life is that we have forgotten this dimension of knowing, reducing all knowledge to what can be grasped through immediate analysis. We have become like people trying to appreciate a symphony by studying only the physics of sound waves, missing entirely the musical meaning that emerges only through contemplative listening. When we recover the art of contemplative engagement, we discover that reality possesses depths of meaning that pure analysis cannot fathom. Chapter 2: The Contemplative Method, Attention as the Gateway to Understanding. True contemplation is not passive daydreaming but the most active form of attention possible. It requires training the mind to sustain focused awareness without the restless urge to manipulate or immediately categorize what is observed. This quality of attention opens pathways to understanding that remain closed to the hurried intellect. The contemplative method begins with what I call receptive concentration, the ability to hold our attention steadily on an object of study while remaining open to whatever it might reveal. Unlike analytical concentration, which approaches reality with predetermined questions and methods, contemplative attention waits upon truth with patient expectancy. This requires considerable discipline, as our minds naturally want to grasp, categorize, and move quickly to the next thing. Consider how you might contemplatively engage with a philosophical text. Rather than immediately analyzing arguments or seeking practical applications, you would first read with what the medievals called lectio divina, a slow, meditative engagement that allows the text's deeper meanings to emerge gradually. You would return to key passages repeatedly, not to memorize them but to dwell with them until their full significance unfolds. This method requires cultivating what I term intellectual humility, the recognition that truth often exceeds our immediate comprehension and deserves patient respect rather than quick conquest. The contemplative scholar approaches each text, each problem, each reality as potentially containing depths that will only reveal themselves to sustained, reverential attention. The fruits of this method are remarkable. Students who learn to engage contemplatively discover that understanding often arrives suddenly, as if truths that were previously opaque suddenly become luminously clear. This is not magic but the natural result of providing the proper conditions for insight to emerge. Just as physical rest allows the body to restore itself, contemplative attention allows deeper understanding to crystallize. The practice requires specific disciplines that can be cultivated systematically. Begin each study session with a period of mental quieting, not emptying the mind but calming its restless movements so that you can attend fully to what you wish to understand. This is not religious practice but intellectual hygiene, preparing the mind for optimal receptivity. Learn to read slowly, especially with texts that contain profound insights. Speed reading serves well for gathering information, but contemplative reading seeks transformation rather than mere accumulation. When you encounter a passage that seems particularly rich, resist the urge to move immediately to analysis. Instead, hold it in awareness, allowing its meaning to resonate throughout your consciousness. Develop the habit of returning repeatedly to the same texts, problems, or questions. Each encounter reveals new dimensions of meaning as your understanding deepens and your contemplative capacity grows. What seemed simple at first reading often reveals profound complexity upon patient return, while apparently difficult passages become clear through sustained engagement. Most importantly, learn to recognize the difference between forcing understanding and allowing it to emerge. The contemplative mind exerts effort not through aggressive pushing but through sustained attention and patient waiting. This requires faith that truth will reveal itself to the properly prepared mind, a faith confirmed by centuries of contemplative practitioners across all traditions. The goal is not to abandon critical thinking but to provide it with the richest possible foundation. When contemplative insight illuminates the essential structure of a problem, analytical reasoning can then proceed with far greater precision and confidence. Chapter 3: Silence and Solitude, Creating Conditions for Deep Understanding. The modern intellectual works in constant noise, not just auditory noise, but the deeper noise of mental restlessness, perpetual connectivity, and fragmented attention. Yet the deepest insights require what I call fertile silence, not mere absence of sound, but a quality of inner stillness that allows subtle truths to emerge. Silence serves understanding in ways that most scholars never discover. When the mind's constant commentary quiets, we begin to hear what reality itself is saying. This is not mystical metaphor but practical psychology. Our usual mental chatter, the endless stream of associations, judgments, and immediate reactions, often drowns out the subtle voice of genuine insight. Consider how breakthrough discoveries typically occur. They rarely arrive during intense analytical effort but in moments of relaxed attention, during walks, in quiet contemplation, or upon waking. This pattern reveals something profound about how understanding actually develops. The mind needs periods of receptive quietude to integrate information and allow new patterns of meaning to crystallize. Solitude serves a similar function. Not mere physical isolation, but the quality of attention that emerges when we step back from the social pressure to have immediate opinions and quick responses. In solitude, we can engage with ideas on their own terms rather than as ammunition for debate or displays of cleverness. This allows for the kind of honest intellectual encounter that transforms understanding rather than merely reinforcing existing positions. The contemplative scholar therefore cultivates both outer and inner silence. Outer silence involves creating physical conditions conducive to deep thinking, spaces free from unnecessary distraction and interruption. But inner silence is more crucial, the discipline of quieting mental reactivity so that we can listen to what we are studying rather than simply projecting our existing ideas onto it. Practical silence requires both scheduling and inner discipline. Set aside regular periods, even brief ones, for contemplative engagement with your studies. Begin each session with a few moments of conscious quieting, settle your body, slow your breathing, and allow your mind's restless movements to settle like sediment in still water. This is not meditation in a religious sense but intellectual preparation. Learn to distinguish between productive and unproductive forms of mental activity. Productive thinking moves toward greater clarity and understanding, while unproductive thinking simply circles around existing ideas without progress. Contemplative silence helps you recognize this difference and gently redirect attention toward fruitful engagement. Physical solitude supports this inner discipline by removing external pressures for immediate response or performance. In genuine solitude, you can afford to not know temporarily, to sit with questions without rushing toward premature answers. This tolerance for uncertainty is crucial for accessing deeper levels of understanding. Create what I call contemplative containers, specific times and places dedicated solely to this deeper engagement with learning. Protect these spaces fiercely from the encroachment of urgent but ultimately less important activities. Remember that the insights emerging from contemplative study often prove more valuable than anything achieved through hurried effort. Most importantly, learn to trust the process. Initial periods of contemplative silence may feel unproductive compared to the immediate satisfaction of analytical thinking. But as you develop this capacity, you will discover that silence does not slow learning but accelerates it by providing access to forms of understanding unavailable to the restless mind. Chapter 4: The Transformation of Memory, From Storage to Wisdom. Most students treat memory as a storage device, a repository for facts to be retrieved when needed. But contemplative engagement transforms memory into something far more profound, a living capacity for wisdom that enriches every subsequent encounter with truth. This transformation represents one of contemplation's most remarkable gifts to the intellectual life. Contemplative memory differs fundamentally from mere retention of information. When we engage contemplatively with important ideas, they do not simply occupy mental space but become integrated into our very way of seeing and understanding. A contemplatively absorbed text continues to yield insights years later, not because we have memorized it perfectly but because it has become part of our intellectual character. This process requires what medieval scholars called ruminatio, a slow, meditative digestion of important truths until they become thoroughly assimilated. Just as physical nutrition requires time for food to be broken down and incorporated into bodily tissues, intellectual nutrition requires patient contemplation for ideas to become genuine wisdom rather than mere information. The contemplative approach to memory also changes how we relate to forgetting. Instead of viewing forgotten details as failures of retention, we learn to trust that truly important insights have been absorbed at levels deeper than conscious recall. The contemplative scholar discovers that essential truths remain available even when specific formulations are forgotten, emerging spontaneously when needed. This transformed memory serves as a foundation for creativity and insight. When ideas have been contemplatively absorbed rather than merely memorized, they combine and recombine in novel ways, generating fresh understanding. The mind becomes like fertile soil in which new growths emerge from the rich compost of contemplatively digested experience. The cultivation of contemplative memory requires specific practices that differ markedly from conventional study techniques. Rather than attempting to memorize through repetition, focus on understanding the inner logic and essential structure of what you study. When you grasp why something is true, rather than merely that it is true, the insight becomes naturally memorable because it connects organically with your existing understanding. Practice what I call memorial contemplation, returning periodically to texts and ideas that have particularly nourished your thinking, not to study them again but to allow them to continue their work of transformation. Like visiting old friends, these encounters deepen appreciation and understanding while revealing new dimensions of meaning. Develop the habit of pausing after reading significant passages to allow their meaning to settle into consciousness. This brief contemplative pause, perhaps only 30 seconds, permits deeper absorption than hours of hurried reading. The mind needs time to integrate new insights, and contemplative pauses provide this essential processing time. Learn to distinguish between information that serves immediate practical needs and wisdom that enriches long-term understanding. While both have their place, contemplative memory focuses on the latter, insights that continue growing in significance over time rather than facts that quickly become obsolete. Most importantly, trust that contemplative engagement creates forms of retention that transcend mere recall. Ideas absorbed contemplatively become part of your intellectual intuition, shaping how you approach new problems and perceive new truths. This transformation of memory from storage device to living wisdom represents one of contemplation's greatest gifts to serious students. Chapter 5: The Rhythm of Contemplative Learning, Effort and Rest in Perfect Balance. One of the most destructive myths of modern academic life is that intellectual progress requires constant effort. Students exhaust themselves in frantic activity, believing that more hours of study automatically translate into deeper understanding. Yet contemplative tradition reveals a profound truth: learning follows natural rhythms that include both effort and rest, concentration and receptivity, analysis and integration. The contemplative approach recognizes that the mind, like the body, requires periods of rest for optimal performance. But this is not mere physical fatigue, it involves understanding how insights actually develop. Important understandings often require what I call gestation periods, times when the mind processes information below the threshold of consciousness, allowing new patterns of meaning to emerge. Consider how musicians practice. They do not simply repeat passages endlessly but alternate focused effort with periods of rest, allowing muscle memory and musical understanding to develop naturally. Similarly, contemplative learning involves alternating between periods of concentrated attention and receptive waiting, creating optimal conditions for deep understanding to crystallize. This rhythm prevents the intellectual exhaustion that plagues so many serious students. When we honor the natural alternation between effort and rest, Study becomes sustainable over decades rather than leading to burnout after a few years. The contemplative scholar learns to work with natural rhythms rather than against them. The resting phases are not passive but involve a different quality of attention, receptive rather than active, patient rather than urgent. During these periods, previously studied material continues its work of transformation, often yielding insights that emerge spontaneously when the mind is relaxed and open. Understanding these rhythms requires careful attention to your own patterns of learning and insight. Notice when you feel most receptive to new ideas and when your analytical capacity is strongest. Many students discover that their deepest insights come not during intense study sessions but in the quiet moments that follow, while walking, in the shower, or upon waking. Plan your study schedule to honor these natural rhythms. Alternate periods of focused analytical work with contemplative engagement and genuine rest. This is not laziness but wisdom, working with your mind's natural capacity rather than forcing it beyond sustainable limits. Learn to recognize when continued effort becomes counterproductive. If you find yourself cycling through the same thoughts without progress, this often signals the need for a contemplative pause. Step back, allow the mind to settle, and return to the problem with fresh attention. Often, what seemed intractable before becomes clear after this brief reset. Develop what I call contemplative patience, the ability to allow understanding to unfold according to its own timing rather than forcing it according to artificial deadlines. This does not mean procrastination but rather trusting that some insights require maturation time and cannot be rushed without being diminished. The goal is sustainable excellence rather than intense bursts that lead to exhaustion. When you learn to work with natural rhythms of effort and rest, concentration and receptivity, your capacity for deep learning actually increases over time rather than diminishing through burnout. Create daily rhythms that include both focused study and contemplative reflection. Begin each study period with a brief contemplative preparation. Engage in concentrated analysis or reading, then conclude with a period of reflective integration. This simple rhythm maximizes both immediate learning and long-term retention. Chapter 6: Contemplative Reading, the Art of Receiving Wisdom from Texts. Most people read to extract information, scanning quickly for useful facts or confirming arguments. But contemplative reading seeks transformation, approaching texts as potential catalysts for deeper understanding rather than mere sources of data. This fundamental shift in approach opens dimensions of meaning that remain invisible to hurried readers. Contemplative reading begins with the recognition that truly important texts contain layers of meaning that reveal themselves gradually. A passage that seems simple upon first reading may contain profound insights that emerge only through patient return and reflection. This requires abandoning the modern preference for consuming large quantities of material in favor of deep engagement with carefully chosen texts. The method involves what medieval scholars called lectio divina, sacred reading that prioritizes transformation over information. You read slowly, allowing each significant passage to resonate fully before moving forward. When you encounter ideas that seem particularly rich or challenging, you pause to contemplate their full implications rather than rushing to categorize or critique them. This approach requires developing what I call receptive intelligence, the capacity to receive what a text is actually saying rather than projecting your existing ideas onto it. Many readers unconsciously filter everything through their current beliefs, seeing only what confirms their existing positions. Contemplative reading demands the humility to let texts challenge and change your understanding. The fruits of this method are remarkable. Students who learn contemplative reading discover that a single carefully chosen book, read with proper attention, often provides more genuine insight than dozens of books consumed hurriedly. Quality of engagement matters more than quantity of material covered. Practical contemplative reading requires specific disciplines that can be developed systematically. Choose your texts carefully, focusing on works that have demonstrated lasting value rather than merely current relevance. A classic text that has nourished minds for centuries likely contains depths that a contemporary work, however clever, may lack. Read with a pen in hand, not to take extensive notes but to mark passages that seem particularly significant. Return to these marked passages regularly, not to memorize them but to allow their meaning to continue unfolding. Often, a passage that seemed merely interesting becomes profoundly illuminating upon contemplative return. Develop the discipline of reading complete works rather than fragments or summaries. Important ideas require context to be properly understood, and the author's full development of a theme often reveals subtleties lost in abbreviated versions. Contemplative reading is necessarily slow reading, but it achieves depth that quick scanning cannot match. Learn to sit with questions that arise during reading rather than immediately seeking answers elsewhere. Allow the text itself to gradually reveal its meaning through patient attention. This tolerance for temporary confusion often leads to insights that premature research would prevent. Practice what I call contemplative critique, first seeking to understand what an author is actually saying before evaluating whether it is true or useful. Many students rush to judgment before achieving genuine comprehension, missing opportunities for their understanding to be expanded or corrected. Finally, maintain a contemplative library, a collection of texts that have proven particularly nourishing to your intellectual and spiritual development. Return to these regularly, not as a scholar researching a topic but as a student seeking continued formation. Each return typically reveals new dimensions of meaning as your capacity for understanding deepens. Chapter 7: The Integration of Knowledge, How Contemplation Creates Wisdom. The final and perhaps most important fruit of contemplative learning is the integration of scattered knowledge into coherent wisdom. Modern education tends to fragment understanding into specialized compartments, producing experts who know much about little but struggle to see the larger patterns that connect all truth. Contemplative engagement reveals these deeper unities, transforming mere information into genuine wisdom. This integration occurs naturally when we approach learning contemplatively rather than merely analytically. Instead of storing facts in isolated mental compartments, contemplative attention perceives the underlying connections that relate all genuine knowledge. Mathematics reveals itself as connected to music, philosophy to science, ethics to aesthetics, not through forced analogies but through recognition of shared principles. The contemplative mind develops what I call synthetic vision, the capacity to perceive how apparently diverse truths actually illuminate each other. This is not vague generalization but precise recognition of the formal principles that operate across different domains of reality. Such vision transforms the scholar from a collector of facts into a genuine intellectual, one who sees the unity underlying apparent diversity. This integration serves practical purposes as well. The person who has achieved some degree of wisdom can approach new problems with greater insight because they recognize patterns and principles that transcend specific contexts. Their accumulated understanding becomes a living resource for engagement with whatever challenges arise. Perhaps most importantly, integrated knowledge becomes a source of joy rather than mere professional competence. When you begin to perceive the deep harmonies that connect all truth, study becomes not just duty but delight, a participation in the eternal conversation between mind and reality that constitutes the highest human activity. The cultivation of integrated wisdom requires both contemplative patience and systematic effort. Begin by seeking connections between apparently unrelated areas of your study. How do the principles you learn in one field illuminate problems in another? What formal similarities exist between different domains of knowledge? Develop the habit of contemplating the philosophical foundations underlying your specific areas of expertise. Every specialized field rests upon metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and human knowing. Making these assumptions explicit often reveals unexpected connections with other disciplines. Practice what I call contemplative synthesis, regularly stepping back from detailed study to contemplate the larger patterns emerging from your learning. What themes recur across different authors and traditions? What perennial questions seem to arise in every serious intellectual endeavor? Read broadly as well as deeply, not to become a dilettante but to provide material for synthetic insight. The contemplative mind needs exposure to diverse perspectives to perceive the underlying unities that connect all genuine knowledge. A steady diet of only specialized literature often produces learned ignorance rather than wisdom. Most importantly, cultivate reverence for truth itself rather than merely for your particular area of expertise. This reverence creates the humility necessary for genuine integration, as you recognize that your specialized knowledge participates in but does not exhaust the total reality of truth. The goal is not encyclopedic knowledge but what the ancients called scientia, knowledge organized by understanding of first principles and ultimate purposes. When your learning achieves this integration, you possess not just information but wisdom, knowledge transformed by understanding into a living capacity for engaging reality with insight and appropriate response. Conclusion. The path I have described today transforms the very nature of intellectual life from burden into blessing, from mere professional necessity into sacred vocation. When you learn to approach truth contemplatively, study becomes not just accumulation of facts but genuine encounter with reality. This transformation requires patience, discipline, and faith in dimensions of knowledge that our hurried age has largely forgotten. Remember that contemplative learning is not an escape from rigorous thinking but its highest expression. When analysis is grounded in contemplative insight, it achieves both greater precision and deeper significance. When memory is transformed through contemplative absorption, it becomes wisdom rather than mere storage. When reading becomes contemplative encounter, texts yield treasures that hurried scanning cannot discover. Begin today with small steps, a few moments of silence before study, slower reading of important passages, patient return to texts that have nourished your thinking. Trust that contemplative engagement will gradually transform not just what you know but how you know, opening forms of understanding that serve both truth and humanity. Your intellectual life can become what it was always meant to be, a participation in the eternal conversation between mind and reality that constitutes the highest human joy.